Television wasn't really around till the late 40s, early 50s. Before that, radio was the #1 medium. And that's what everyone listened to in their living room. They had big radio sets where the whole family would sit around and listen to FDR, fireside chats, and ball games. And really, radio was a lot different back then. You had big band leaders that had their own shows, and Bing Crosby and Benny Goodman. Those were the stars of radio back then. Then television came along, and it really cut into radio listening. It kind of did what the internet's doing now. It kind of just replaced it as the #1 medium. And so what was radio supposed to do? Well, a guy in Omaha named Todd Storrs, he came up with an idea when he was at a bar and listening to a jukebox, noticed that, the same songs kept coming up over and over and over again on the jukebox, and those would get the best reactions. People only had to put a dime in a jukebox back then, and gave him the idea, what can we do with radio? Because back then it was block programming. The programming was a lot like public radio today, where it changed format every hour. So you'd have a lot of variety on radio back then. He came up with the idea, Todd Storrs of Omaha. Why not create a format where the whole day you're hearing the same songs over and over and over again? I wonder if that would work. It works in a bar with a jukebox. So he tried it out, and it actually worked. It started getting a big audience. And then so other stations around the country found out about it. He started buying other stations around the country. That's kind of how Top 40 Radio was born. A mix of Todd's idea and rock and roll, because rock and roll brought in the youth. Kids were like, they wanted to break away and have their own thing. And so radio stations started to cater to kids by realizing that, it's free entertainment. Kids don't have a lot of money. And then in 1957, when Sony put out the TR-63, which is a portable radio, basically those are the components. You put it all together. That's how rock and roll / Top 40 radio was born. In Sacramento, the first station to play that kind of music was KGMS. And the call letters stood for the names of the owners, and the M was Matranga, who owned Channel 40. I think they experimented with it in the 50s, but it didn't really become a full-time thing until the 60s, late 60s. So KGMS, which kind of was the sister station of what became Channel 40, was a station that played lots of hits in the 50s. And the 50s, if you go back and look at the charts, it wasn't all rock and roll. It was still a cross between big band and lounge music, a lot of ballads. The biggest hit of the 50s was Mac the Knife by Bobby Darin, which is like a 30s cover of from Three Penny Opera, which is a big band, big band classic is what it is. So you still had a lot of big band music mixed with rock and roll. Even the song Rock Around the Clock by Bill Haley and the Comets, 1955. First #1 song ever on Billboard that can be considered a rock and roll song. That has a lot of big band elements in it, with saxophone and the swing sound to it. So you had a merging of styles going on. KGMS dropped their rock pop format in 1962, and then went more toward Frank Sinatra music and more easy listening music. Meanwhile, Croy, remember them? They were the second station in Sacramento. By 1960, they jumped into the act. They wanted to start playing pop music, so they were like the next station. Even in the late 50s, they were sprinkling in lots of hits, along with another station It started in the 40s here in town, called 1470 KXOA. Okay, so by the 50s, you had a lot of stations in Sacramento. One of them was a sister station to the TV station KCRA, Channel 3. That radio station was at 1320 on the AM dial. KGMS was 1380. And so you had about, well, half a dozen stations in the 50s, all on AM still. But you also started to have some FMs, and those FMs were just sister properties of the AMs. Nobody had FM receivers back then, so you couldn't really do anything with FM stations until the 60s. That's when people started investing in those kind of radios. And even then the coverage was very spotty. You couldn't drive around in your car and listen to FM radio until the late 70s to hear a consistent signal. You'd hear what's called ghosting, which is lots of stations bleeding on each other or in and out, stations. Meanwhile, AM was always, I'm sorry?
You know how to bounce it off the throat today. The FM.
Well,
it was supposed to be line of sight.
Well, I don't want to get too much into the technology of radio, because then we get deep into really theoretical stuff. AM radio has two waves. It has a ground wave and a sky wave. So that's why you're able to get San Francisco stations in Sacramento. It's because of not the sky wave, which goes out into outer space if there's holes in the atmosphere. That's what causes static. But the ground wave, it's sending out two waves. The ground wave follows the curve of the Earth. That's why we can get it in Sacramento. KFRC was the most popular station in San Francisco in the 60s and 70s. They played top 40 music, and we could get it here in Sacramento all along. The 1960s was an amazing time for radio here because, like I said, freeform radio was developing. It basically started with college radio, a station in town called KERS. It's Sac State. My alma mater, I'm from Sac State. That's how I got the job at Quad in '84. It was an internship through Sac State. And a lot of KZAP jocks came from KERS. That's where they learned radio. And at KERS, they got to play whatever they wanted. They didn't have to be like top 40 where the PD controlled the whole playlist, and who knows who controlled the PD on the record label side. So KZAP came on the week Richard M. Nixon was elected president somehow in America in 1968, November 1968. KZAP became a very political station, a very anti-Nixon, anti-war station. So they signed on just that same week, or November 8th, 1968. I don't remember the election date, but that was pretty much it. And KZAP, the very first song they played on their sign-on was by the most popular band of that time, who remains the most popular band in history, the Beatles. And the song was Revolution. So basically, it was a revolution, freeform radio, because DJs got to play what they wanted again. And they could play anything. KZAP did not start off as just a rock and roll station. It was all formats. It was every kind of music you can imagine mixed into one radio station.